welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. We begin with Russian Defense Ministry saying Russian forces have shot down multiple Ukrainian aircrafts and intercepted several HIMARS rockets in the latest development of its special military operation in Ukraine. According to a report, the downed aircraft include 2 Su-25 ground attack planes and 15 drones. Russian forces also launched a large-scale strike with sea-based long-range high-precision weapons at Ukraine's depots of foreign-made military equipment and points of temporary deployment of foreign mercenaries, plus offensives in various fronts. Meanwhile, on the same day, a report from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces suggested Russia continued to concentrate its troops in Lyman, Bakhmut, Andeyivka and Mariinka, while the Ukrainian Air Forces has struck Russian ammunition depots, electronic warfare systems and other targets, and conducted multiple airstrikes on Russian forces' positions. In the meantime, Ukraine's 57th Motorized Brigade fired artillery shells near Bakhmut on Wednesday using Soviet-made and Ukrainian-made NATO standard howitzers alike. Russia also reported its forces had struck 3 Ukrainian army groups near Bakhmut, but Kyiv claims its forces, despite limited control in the long-contested city, had the Russians all but pinned down. Russia's Wagner mercenary group captured the shattered eastern city of Bakhmut in May after 10 months of fighting. The commander of the Bodana self-propelled howitzer, which fires 155 millimeters NATO standard caliber shells, said since Wagner mercenary fighters had left positions in Bakhmut some time ago, Russia threw in weaker troops. The Russian army in the area has since come under fierce pressure from Ukrainian forces who threatened to encircle it. The Russian Defense Ministry made no comments in its daily briefing on reports that Russian forces had retreated from the village of Kalishkivka, just southwest of Bakhmut. And now neighboring Belarus, where Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko is suggesting that talks aimed at resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine could start by autumn. The Belarusian president said earlier he was ready to mediate Ukraine peace talks if Moscow and Kyiv deem it necessary.
There is a little chance that peace talk will take place in September, but a lot tells us that the situation will change by autumn and we'll start talking at the negotiating table. It's possible, maybe not in September, a bit later, but in the autumn. I don't want to give out any specific information, but the Europeans are already talking about it.
During a visit to the Czech Republic, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Kyiv needed long-range weapons for both offensive and defensive operations to fight Russian forces that have invaded his country. President Zelensky also mentioned that Ukraine was talking about long-range systems with many partners, including the United States. He was visiting Prague as part of a foreign tour before a NATO summit next week, at which he has urged the military alliance to take concrete steps towards Ukrainian membership. He also called in Prague for accession talks to start this year with the European Union. Well, staying with the Ukrainian leader, who has called on NATO leaders to take concrete steps towards Ukrainian membership at the summit next week. He says Ukraine wants to join as quickly as possible, but NATO members have been divided over how fast that step should be taken. Some member countries are wary of moves they fear could take the alliance closer to an active war with Russia. The Czech Republic, a NATO member, has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine since the invasion last year, supplying military aid and other assistance.
Pozice Ukrajiny posílena tím, že
Staying with President Zelensky's tour, this time the meeting in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian leadership agreed on more active cooperation in the defense sector as Mr. Zelensky invited Sofia to take part in Ukraine's reconstruction. He thanked his hosts in Sofia for their support as Ukraine battles Russian forces who launched their full-scale invasion. Ukraine wants to receive an invitation to begin the process of joining NATO at the July 11 to 12th summit in Vilnius. The Bulgarian Prime Minister Nikolai Denkov signed a declaration on Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration, and shortly before, Mr. Zelensky and Denkov gave speeches. A memorandum on energy cooperation was also signed between the two countries. The United States plans to send cluster munitions to Ukraine to help it battle Russian invaders. However, this is a move opposed by human rights groups, but which would provide a powerful new element to Ukraine's counteroffensive. A weapons aid package that includes cluster munitions fired by a 155mm howitzer cannon is expected to be announced as soon as today, and that's according to 3 U.S. officials speaking on condition of anonymity. The measure is set to be under serious consideration for at least a week. The White House said sending cluster munitions to Ukraine is under active consideration, but it had no announcement to make. President Joe Biden is to attend a NATO summit next week, and that's expected to be dominated by the war in Ukraine. And tensions were high at Thursday's UN Security Council meeting to discuss the Iranian nuclear deal due to the participation of Ukraine's representative during the debate. At the beginning of the session, Russia's representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, objected to the presence of Ukraine's ambassador and accused the British presidency of the Council of trying to Ukrainize the session.
Distinguished colleagues, consider this. Today, the proposal is made for you to break this arrangement for the advancement of the parochial agenda of the British presidency, which has a desire to Ukrainize, so to speak, everything, even the most important work of the Council. The invitation for participation in today's meeting, in violation of the long-standing practice, an invitation to Ukraine, which is not a party to the nuclear deal, is a politicized, provocative step geared towards undermining a constructive discussion on 2231 at the Security Council. This is yet another stain on the reputation of London as president of the Security Council.
Representatives from the US, UK and the head of the EU delegation announced Russia for allegedly using Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles in its aggression against Ukraine and called on Iran to adhere to international law. Russia denies the accusations. The Council's meeting aimed to discuss the implementation of the 2015 nuclear agreement, which limited Iran's disputed uranium enrichment activity to make it harder for Tehran to develop the means to produce nuclear weapons in return for lifting international sanctions against it.
We are extremely worried about Iran's military support to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, including through deliveries of drones. This has not stopped and rather expanded. The EU calls on the government of Iran to stop that military cooperation with a country that is violating every principle of the UN Charter. The EU will continue to respond to this as necessary.
The United States remains gravely concerned with Russia's use of Iranian drones against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure in its unprovoked war against Ukraine. Both Iran and Russia have violated their obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 2231 by participating in these transfers without obtaining advance approval from the UN Security Council. Russia's acquisition of hundreds of Iranian drones and now production of those drones on its own territory, however, dramatically changes the equation. This is a flagrant violation of Resolution 2231. We should not be shy about condemning this destabilizing and dangerous behavior.
There is overwhelming evidence that Iran continues to provide material support to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, supplying UAVs with a range of over 300 kilometers.
Since September 2022, the Russian Federation has massively used the Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles of the Shahed-131, Shahed-136 and Mohajer-6 types in its full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. As of today, more than 1,000 launches by the Russian Federation of the Iranian UAVs over the territory of Ukraine have been recorded. If Russia insists that the photos with Iranian drones are fake, why do you so resolutely oppose the UN inspection?
We don't recognize the presence of Ukraine in this meeting, and we have no intention of addressing the baseless allegation put forth by the representative of Ukraine or certain member states against my country during this meeting regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Certain council members are deliberately attempting to divert international attention away from the root causes of the current situation concerning the implementation of the JCPOA and the ongoing material violation of Resolution 2231 by United States since the illegitimate withdrawal from the agreement in 2018.
The meeting is adjourned.
Away from that UN Security Council meeting, Russia and Ukraine have swapped 45 prisoners of war in the latest exchange between the warring countries. The head of Ukraine's presidential staff, Andriy Yermak, said 45 service personnel and 2 civilians had been returned to Ukraine. In a post on Telegram, Yermak pointed out that some of those freed had fought in Mariupol and the southern city's Azovstal steel plant, and others had fought on the front line elsewhere. In a separate post, he wrote that 2 children, aged 6 and 10, had been allowed to return to Ukraine following the release of their mother, a military medic, last October. Ukraine's human rights ombudsman, Dmytro Kulybinets, added that most of those freed are seriously injured and all would undergo rehabilitation. Lubinets said that 2,576 Ukrainians have been freed in prisoner swaps since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor, February 2022. And Ukraine's military spy chief, Kirilo Budanov, is of the opinion that the threat of a Russian attack on the vast Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is receding, but that it could be on the rise as long as the facility remains under occupation by Moscow's forces. Budanov made the comment in an interview after days of warnings by Ukrainian and Russian officials accusing each other of plotting an attack at Europe's largest nuclear plant. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been warning of the grave threat at the facility, most recently saying Russian forces had mined the roof of several reactors. Budanov made clear he believes the threat had only been postponed until later. He compared the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation with Russia's months-long battle to capture the eastern city of Bakhmut in April. And Russian state TV has launched a fierce attack on Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of an aborted army mercenary mutiny last month, and said an investigation was still being pursued. In the program 60 Minutes, broadcast Wednesday on Russia 1 television, footage was shown that had purportedly been shot during law enforcement raids on Prigozhin's St. Petersburg's office, one of his palaces. The host, lawmaker Yevgeny Popov, called Prigozhin a traitor, and the footage was presented by an invited guest, journalist Eduard Petrov, as proof of Prigozhin's criminal past and his hypocrisy in alleging corruption in the armed forces. The footage showed boxes full of high definition rubles in his office and bundles of dollars in a luxurious residence, along with a helicopter alleged to belong to him, an arms cache, and a collection of wigs. A fully equipped medical treatment room, gold bars, a collection of souvenirs, sledgehammers, the tool Prigozhin called a symbol of vengeance to be used against traitors were also shown. Under the agreements that ended the Prigozhin mutiny, Prigozhin was meant to relocate to neighboring Belarus. In exchange, criminal charges against him were to be dropped, but Belarusian President Mr. Lukashenko, who helped broker the agreement, said that Prigozhin was currently in his native St. Petersburg, and that's Russia's second city. This was as at Wednesday. Well, less than 2 weeks ago, the private Russian paramilitary unit of mercenaries Wagner group, led by Prigozhin, were moving toward Moscow. Prigozhin called it a march of justice to oust Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, whom the Wagner chief had publicly criticized for months. And he was supposed to be in Belarusian exile, as we've mentioned, but then we understand that it's not exactly true, and that's according to Mr. Lukashenko, Belarusian president. Rob Watts, from our partner station Deutsche Welle, DW in Berlin, joins me with more on this. Hi, Rob. What more do we know exactly about Prigozhin's whereabouts?
Well, it's a curious story, the only real source for which is the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. When asked about Yevgeny Prigozhin's whereabouts in Belarus on Thursday, he said, oh, well, actually, he's not in Belarus as per the terms of the deal that ended that Wagner mutiny 2 weeks ago. He was supposed to move, essentially be exiled to Belarus. He says, no, he's already back in Russia less than 2 weeks later. He said it was probably in St. Petersburg or Moscow. St. Petersburg seems like a likely option because that is where Prigozhin has a home. It's his hometown as well. He enjoys a lot of support there. He has a company there, although it is incidentally also the hometown of Vladimir Putin. When asked about this, the Kremlin said that they were not tracking Prigozhin's every move, although that does sound a little bit unlikely, and that it still remained a condition of the end of that mutiny that Prigozhin should move to Belarus. So it says it still expects him to move there. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has been preoccupying itself with discrediting Prigozhin by raiding his home and getting state media to report on that and to show what it says is his lavish home in St. Petersburg, and to try and paint him as someone driven by greed. So the story of Yevgeny Prigozhin and what happens to him after that mutiny is getting stranger and stranger.
The presence of Wagner troops in Belarus will be on the agenda at the major NATO summit next week, but Ukraine's President Zelensky may turn down that invitation to attend. Is that a surprise?
Well, what he wants is NATO membership for his country, and his people have been indicating that there isn't a major promise at the end of that NATO summit. If he isn't going to get what he wants, then potentially he will not go along to that summit. And is it likely to happen? Well, we'll get into that, because it's a tricky one for all members of NATO. You have a bit of a split. You have those that say, yes, we should immediately allow Ukraine into NATO because that will send a message to Russia that they cannot violate the borders of European democracies. But then you have the more cautious member states who say, look, Putin has been using the potential accession to NATO of Ukraine as a pretext for this war. It's one of the ways in which he justifies it to the Russian people. So why would we enable him to do that further by further advancing Ukraine's accession into NATO? So it's a very tricky situation going into this summit next week.
The big question is, did he get his way?
Well, I wouldn't expect the meeting to end with a promise of immediate entry into NATO for Ukraine, but he is being prepared for the idea that maybe they will make some sort of promise of eventual membership into NATO. The summit's being hosted by Lithuania, and their president has said that he expects the readout at the end of the summit to go further than NATO readouts usually do. And he says that there are upwards of 4 countries that are determined to get Ukraine into NATO, and that those countries are working very hard to persuade other countries to get on side and to make that happen. He also said that If Zelensky comes along, then he can expect promises from individual countries of further military and financial support for Ukraine as it tries to fight off the Russian invasion and advance its own counter-offensive. So Zelensky's being promised that there will be certain advancements in Ukraine's NATO ambitions at this meeting, but how far that will go, we obviously can't say just yet.
Keep watching. Rob Watts, Deutsche Welle correspondent, joining us from Berlin. Many thanks.